All right, so in the previous lesson, we did a quick review of stateless functional components, and in this lesson, we'll do a quick overview of class-based React components. Let's begin by clearing all of our work, and of course, to make a class in JavaScript in ES6, we use the class keyword. We then give our component a name. I'm going to call this one app. And then we need to use the extend syntax to make sure that our component inherits from the component class that we just imported on line number 1 from the React library. This ensures that our React component comes bundled or inherits all of the functionality to make all of its Reacty stuff work from the component class. Now in here, in the body of our class, the only thing that we need to make this work is a render method. And that render method, of course, needs to return some JSX. So here I can put a return with some parentheses. And let's say I want to return a button here, and it's just going to have my text on it. So when I save this and take a look at the right, we have this little button. It appears here at the top left. I can click it. It does absolutely nothing, but this is a valid class-based React component. It's just a component that doesn't actually have any state yet. So let's make this component a bit more dynamic. We'll introduce some component state. And again, a component state just refers to the component's internal data. And that is data that may change over time over the existence of the component. So let's say I want this button to have the concept of being activated or not. And the only difference between the button being activated and not being activated is the text that's going to appear on it. So I'll begin right here by writing a constructor. And this is going to take my props as an argument because a class-based React component can accept props exactly like a stateless functional component can also accept props. In here, we need to use this super props syntax. That just ensures a proper inheritance scheme for app to inherit from the component class that we've imported. And then in here, I can initialize my state. The way I do that is by doing this.state. And then I can assign state to anything, but typically people are going to make it a plain JavaScript object. And in here, you can combine any key value pairs you want that's going to represent the data or the state, the internal information that your component needs to know about. So let's say I want my object to have a single property, and I'm just going to call that property activated, and it's going to have a default initial starting value of false. So now that I have some state in my component, I can use it in any of the component's methods, such as render. So for example, in here, what I can do is create a constant called button text. And this is just going to be a basic ternary expression. I'm going to check what the value is of this.state.activated is. So I'm just accessing that activated property on my state object. And if it evaluates to true, I'm going to give back a string of active, and if it evaluates to false, I'm going to instead assign a string of inactive. And what I can do here is take my button text and simply interpolate it in between these two button HTML elements. So I can simply use my curly brace syntax, write button text and save. And there we see on the right, we have an inactive button right here. So now our component is relying on the state in order to render when it's showing the JSX or the output that we see in the browser window. But unfortunately, we have no way to actually modify the state. So let's begin by writing a function inside the class that's going to change the value of the activated property. So in here, what I'm going to do is define a method called handleActiveChange. And there's two ways that we can change the state. In fact, one way, but with two different syntactical approaches. No matter what, we're going to have to call the this.setState method. And we can pass one of two things to setState. The first is simply an object where we specify the properties that we want to update, as well as their new values. So if I want to update the activated property on my state, I can do activated, and then I provide it the next value, the next thing that it's going to hold. So if I want to invert the value that is currently in the state, currently the activated value, what I can do is get this.state.activated and then invert it with the exclamation point. So if this.state.activated is true, I'm going to invert it to false. And if this.state.activated is false, I'm going to invert it to true. So this is one approach, and this will work. However, the generally preferred approach is to instead pass a function to this.setState. So this.setState, and I'm going to pass it an arrow function. It's going to look like this. And the argument that the arrow function accepts, or that the callback function accepts, is going to represent the previous state of the component. You can typically give it a parameter name like prevState. And this is just going to represent the state of the component as it is when setState starts to run. And what I can return from here is, again, an object. And in here, I'm going to say that I want the activated property to be the inverse of the previous state's activated property. And there's a reason why this is the more advantageous approach, and I've attached an article to this lesson that you can take a look at that explains why. But in the context of a simple example like this, either one of these syntactical choices will work equally. So now we have a technical way to change the state of the component through the handle active change method, but we don't actually have a visual way to trigger this method to run from our user interface. So let's take care of that problem. The typical solution to this is we can add a click handler to the button. A click handler is just a function that will be invoked whenever the button is clicked. So the way we do that to a button is we do the onClick. It almost resembles a prop. And then to this, we can pass a function. And what I can do is just pass the function this.handle active change, which is the function that or method rather, that I defined above that updates the value of the activated property on our state. So we think it's going to work, but if I save this and take a look in the browser and start clicking around, we're actually going to see that it doesn't work. There's one more problem we have to fix. We have to bind the handle active change method to the component itself. This is one of the drawbacks of classes in JavaScript. So you may recall the syntax is going to look like this. This.handle active change equals this.handle active change dot bind, and passing that bind method an argument of this. What this does is say to JavaScript that whenever the handle active change method is invoked, it's going to be invoked with the context of the component representing the this keyword. In other words, the this keyword will represent the app component. This is one of the most complex features of JavaScript, the this keyword, and it's precisely this kind of complexity that's really hard to explain to beginners. And this is one of the pieces of complexity that hooks aim to fix, because there are no more classes in hooks, just plain functions. Much like a stateless functional component, a class-based React component can also use props. So what I want to do here is very similar to what we did in the last lesson. I want to copy all of our code from within our app component, and I want to cut and paste it to a brand new component I'll make above, and I'm just going to call this button. So class button extends component. Let's open it up and paste our cut code here. So now we've extracted all the functionality we just built in app to a button component. So what I can do in here is again define a render method and return an instantiated button component. And if I do this, we should see the exact same result on the page. But now, following the syntax in the previous lesson, we can go ahead and pass props to button. So let's say what I want to do now is, instead of relying on these hard-coded strings of active and inactive, I want the parent component of app to specify what's going to be the active text and the inactive text. So I can define two props here. I can call my first one active text and give it an arbitrary string value of on. And then let's define another prop called inactive text and give this a string of off. This is, of course, just for the sake of example. It's not really an active button, but the point is that we're altering where our button component is going to get its strings from. So in order to make props work, we took care of the first requirement, which is making sure that super props is invoked here. And then the only thing here is, instead of manually hard coding these strings, we can now rely on our props. Now, whenever we have a stateless functional component, we can just use the props argument that's passed in, which is a plain object. This time around, we have to use this.props, and this will get us access to that very same object, that props object with a whole bunch of key value pairs. So at the bottom on this props object, we defined properties of active text and inactive text. So what I can do is just do this.props.active text and replace this string on the right with this.props.inactive text. Sorry about that. Oop. This.props.inactive text. Perfect. So now when I save this, you can see we're going to have a button that starts off with off. And when I click it, we're going to get on. And when I click it again, we're going to get off, so on and so forth. So our functionality to change the state, to change the value of activated, is coming from within our button component. But the actual text that appears when the component is active or not is actually coming from our parent app component. And that's all there is to cover in this lesson. We did a quick review of class-based React components. These are components that can contain state. State is just the component's data. It's information that the component relies on to run. That data, that state, may change over time. We change it with with the set state method, and that is the way that you should always do it. You should never manually rewrite this state except for the initialization in the constructor. Otherwise, you always call set state. And then we also did a quick review of how props work with class-based components. They work the exact same way. The only difference is in the body of the class-based component, you use this .props instead of just the plain props. All right, that's all there is to cover here. We have one more lesson on array destructuring syntax, and then we'll be ready to dive into our very first React hook.